what I thought I would do is give you kind of 6 bullet points to start with, that something about me, insight into me, through the lens of love. Okay, and there's a broader point, so it's not just me sitting here sort of talking about myself. But okay, so I did my PhD in the city of brotherly love, right, Philadelphia. I fell in love with my wife when I was 17, so we're high school sweethearts. This is where you all clap. The best moments, the absolute best moments in my life were the birth of my 3 children, whom I dearly love, as you might suspect. I have closely followed and passionately love the Buffalo Bills since the age of 8. If you can believe it, I used to write poetry about them and have them published in the Democrat and Chronicle in Rochester, where I grew up, Rochester, New York. I have an abiding belief that is deeply rooted in my Christian faith, that God is love. And one of my personal heroes is Corrie ten Boom, whom I'm not sure how many of you will know, but she and her family sacrificially saved hundreds of Jews during the horror of the Holocaust. And it is because she has said of her desire to love and represent God's love. Right? So a little bit of insight into me through the lens of love, as I said. But hopefully what you picked up on there is that each use of the word love is very different. Right? Love is this idea or this concept that we're all ultra familiar with. It's maybe a word that is even overused in our culture, and yet here we are talking about what it is, right? Which is, that in and of itself is a very fascinating sort of statement on our society. If you can believe it, genetics actually touches each of the different kinds of love that I just brought up in talking about who I am. And I don't have time to get into each of them, so I'm just going to highlight 2 that I thought might be particularly interesting in these introductory remarks. One is romantic love, and the other one is the sort of love for the other that sort of is going to come back to Corrie ten Boom a little bit. Okay. So romantic love, this is a little bit of a more lighthearted one, but I do want to convey the relevance of genetics in this context because rightly so, we think of romantic love in a little bit of a sort of whimsical and magical sort of way, right? And nothing that I say now do I want to draw away from that, right? Okay. But I do want to convey that just like any other really complicated social interaction or biological trait, there are some genetic underpinnings to romantic love, right? So there's this really neat study in fruit flies that was done about 10 years ago, and this probably wouldn't call it romantic love, but sexual attraction, mating preferences, okay? And so a female fruit fly was presented with a series of male choices, okay? It turned out that the female could sense, and we don't know exactly what it is, and I don't want to get into the pheromone debate. So we don't know if it's really a smell or sight or touch, and so that's still controversial. But the female could readily sense which males were more genetically compatible. And genetic compatibility is the concept that we're all familiar with, that we try to avoid inbreeding, right? That it's healthier for our offspring to mate with individuals who are genetically dissimilar to ourselves, right? The fruit fly, the female fruit fly could sense the genetically compatible males, and they would avoid the fruit flies that were more genetically similar to the female, right? Fruit flies don't know how to sequence DNA, right? So how do they know that? We don't know exactly, and there's a lot of research actually being done in this, okay? But we do believe that it has something to do with the complete set of chemicals and proteins that your body produces, maybe some of them emitted in the form of pheromones, okay? That elicit a certain response that she is what's called genetically primed to respond to, okay? And so for a while, people thought, well, that's just some weird fruit fly thing, right? But there's now some really interesting research that's emerging that suggests that mice have something similar that might be going on. In fact, so much so that one particular protein found in the urine of mice, okay, this is really taking away from the magic of romantic love, is so powerful in sexual attraction and mating preferences that it has been given the name Darcin, after Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, right? The male heartthrob, okay? And it does appear there's emerging evidence that suggests that different strains of mice produce slightly different kinds of Darcin that female mice are able to pick up on, right? And again, this sort of alluding to this genetic compatibility issue, right? Now, this kind of research has been a lot more complicated in humans, right? And so there's not very much definitive like that I can point to in the human context, but it does suggest the possibility of some kind of genetic underpinning to the preferences that we might have, right, in the kind of social interaction realm, right? Now, the first thing that I and these geneticists involved in these studies would say is that that does not mean genetics predetermines anything here, right? It's not as though it sets you on your course and there's nothing that can change that, right? It's one among many, many factors, and obviously with humans there are a ton of factors that come into play in deciding who you're attracted to or who you're going to fall in love with, right? And certainly my wife is not going to be pleased with the notion that there's something connected to urinary proteins that is what caused us to be together, and nor am I suggesting that in any real way. But it is important to remember that, like most other interactions and traits, as I alluded to previously, there are possibly some genetic underpinnings as well, and it's a very active area of research. Okay, and I think it's really, really neat that it all serves to lead to genetic compatibility, right? This idea of creating healthier offspring in order to perpetuate the species in a healthier way. The second and final thing that I will touch on is the love for other, as I mentioned, right? So Corrie ten Boom, as I mentioned, was a remarkable, remarkable person because of the risks that she took to hide and help hundreds of Jews escape the Nazi occupation in Holland. But what's even more remarkable about her, she was eventually caught, imprisoned, put in a concentration camp. She survived the concentration camp. And after the war, she set up a rehabilitation center, first, primarily, to support Jewish people who had endured so much during that period of time, but also to provide support and rehabilitation for those who supported and actively participated in the Nazi horrors, directly against her and her family, and then many others whom she knew, and then, of course, the Jewish people she was trying to help. That is a remarkable kind of sacrificial forgiveness and laying down of oneself for someone. I mean, could you paint a picture of someone that could possibly be more against you, right? She was able to look deep into these people and feel that what united her with them was stronger than what divided her from them. Right? This is really powerful, and it came out of her Christian ethic that every person is made in the image of God. Every person is made in the image of God, and she worked hard to connect deeply with that person, look past the horrors of what they had done to see them as someone that had just as much capacity to reflect the love of God as she did. Right? And I think this is amazing to us because it's not a part of our natural experience. Usually, we're putting up walls, right? We're finding ways in which we can be different from some other people, right? We've got this group and that group and that group, and we're always stratifying and grouping, right? This is, I think, a shared experience for all of us, and some feel the brunt of it more than others in our society. But we're constantly engaged at this kind of thing, and so when you come across someone like Corrie ten Boom, it's life-changing, it's transformative, right? Because she's breaking down those walls and barriers. Okay, so what does genetics have anything to do with it? I think genetics, particularly genetic studies in the past 30 years, have done a tremendous job of breaking down the barriers that we have worked really hard to put up but that are completely false and arbitrary, right? So this whole notion of race, for example, which tremendously troubles our society and our world, is a completely artificial construct and has no scientific basis, right? And I mean, sociologists have been actually saying this for some time, but the geneticists have been getting on board over the course of the last 30 years in particular with a lot of empirical data and studies to demonstrate that it's a very weak proxy for, ethnic differences, right? That race is completely based on our perception of things like skin color and hair type, right? Which are extremely poor ways of separating people genetically, right? So for example, you could identify one African in one tribe and another African in another tribe, and they would be more genetically dissimilar than one of those Africans and a European, right? This has now become very, very commonplace knowledge among geneticists, but we're still working hard to communicate these things to the lay public in order to convey that genetics is really helping, is very complementary with the, equalizing work of the gospel of Christ, right? That we are all kind of one, that there is no one that is better than another. Genetics is now coming behind to say, that's true, right? These differences are completely artificial and fabricated, right? And the sooner we embrace that, right, the easier of a time maybe we'll begin to have doing what Corrie ten Boom does.